That's good. That's fine.
Enough.
It goes on like that. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Bueno, después
I wanted to try and get the flow of some of the dancing was sort of, it was a little bit slow actually. It turned the mix it came out a bit too slow, but anyway, that's why.
Todo perfecto. Los recibimos o los estábamos esperando. Bienvenidos a todos con una canción que tocó en la guitarra Paul Gilbert. Así que bienvenidos a los que estén llegando. Les proponemos hacer recibirlos con unos breves minutos de asentar la respiración. Así que, si les parece, los invitamos a acomodar la espalda en donde estén sentados, alejar los hombros de las orejas. Si quisieran cerrar un poquito los ojos o poner la mirada en un punto fijo. Y llevar toda la atención hacia adentro, hacia el ritmo calmante de la respiración. Y vamos a hacerlo enlenteciéndolo despacio. Los invito a traer a la mente la imagen de un globo y que el aire entre lento por la nariz y quizá inflando este globo podemos ir soltando el aire por la boca. Lo que probablemente nos ayude a enlentecer el ritmo. Quizá eso haga que empiecen a sentir el cuerpo un poquito más pesado, un poco más estable en la postura que tiene cada uno en la silla o en el piso, si estuvieran en el piso. Nos invitamos a quedarnos un ratito o un par de respiraciones en este ritmo calmante. Tómense los próximos 2 ciclos de respiraciones completas, inhalando y exhalando lento y suave, para abrir los ojos, conectarse con la pantalla y aprovechar una hora de este maravilloso visitante o invitado que tenemos hoy. Así que los dejo con Nati, que va a hacer las presentaciones.
Gracias, Cuca. Bienvenidos a todos nuevamente. Muchas gracias, Paul, por estar acá. Todos los que estamos acá presentes en el Zoom y también por YouTube, sabemos, conocemos y sobre todo sabemos en qué trabaja Paul Gilbert. Pero a mí me gustaría hoy presentarlo desde comenzar no por lo académico, sino realmente por aquellas cualidades que Paul presenta y que encarna, porque si hay alguien que puede demostrarnos o compartirnos cómo se encarna la compasión, para mí es Paul Gilbert, así que tengo el honor y la vida me dio la oportunidad de no solamente conocer y percibir cómo Paul encarna estas cualidades compasivas, sino también cómo está atento a cada detalle, a cada esa sensibilidad tan implícita que lo acompaña y que siempre permite que pueda estar con la palabra justa, con la sugerencia justa, con la información justa, y que eso lo permite a alguien que está atento y que es sensible al otro. básicamente las cualidades de encarnar la compasión nuevamente. Así que bueno, Paul es psicólogo, como todos ya sabemos, ha sido jefe de psicólogo clínico, es creador del Compassionate Mind Foundation en Londres, es creador de la terapia centrada en la compasión y del entrenamiento compasivo de la mente, ha sido jefe de la unidad de investigación de salud mental del servicio NHS de Inglaterra, y ha escrito un montón de libros, los cuales todos de pe a pa son un lujo de poder leer y aprender para todo para todo el recorrido que quieran hacer con CFT desde esta mirada. Paul nació en África y también es economista, con lo cual tiene un recorrido inmenso, más allá de la psicología. Y hoy, Paul, la intención de convocarte, y como siempre, tan dispuesto y tan abierto y tan amable hacia motivación compasiva con cada una de nosotras y con cada propuesta que te llevamos, es poder compartir con todos los presentes y con todas las personas que te puedan escuchar después también, cómo podemos a través del cultivo de la compasión ir de a poco acompañándonos con estas cualidades de sabiduría, de coraje, de responsabilidad y de compromiso, con todo el malestar que nos viene acompañando en estos últimos grandes meses, que sabemos que es una pandemia que nos viene atravesando a todos a nivel mundial, a todos en la salud mental, a todos en la salud física, en la economía, y etcétera, etcétera. Pero, ¿por qué sería la compasión una cualidad que podemos cultivar a pesar de estar en esta situación de encierro? Como te contábamos acá en Argentina, estamos pronto de poder levantar el aislamiento. ¿Y cómo surge CFT también? ¿Cuáles son los comienzos? Gracias, Paul.
Well, thank you, Natalie, for inviting me, and Lorena and Maria and everybody. It's been wonderful. And I had a wonderful time when I was there with you last year, and hopefully it won't be too long and we can come to Argentina again. So the story is back in the 1970s, I did a PhD in Edinburgh on depression. That's where I began. And in those days, I was very interested in trying to understand how psychological processes produced physical changes in the brain. On the Medical Research Council unit, they were all studying drugs and brain chemistry. So I had to learn a little bit about that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had any friends. So my first book was called Depression from Psychology to Brain State. Now, this is important because all the way through, CFT is very concerned about the link between the body and the brain and the mind. Okay, that's very important. And although we're sometimes called a third wave cognitive behavior therapy, we've never really been that. We've never been that. We've always been an evolutionary based biopsychosocial model, trying to understand the ways in which people interact with their environment and how that changes them physiologically, but also how we can do exercises and things to bring our physiology back in line with ways of feeling, well-being and so forth. So that's sort of a little bit of the background. And then I wrote a book called Human Nature and Suffering in 1989, and that was all about motivations and how motivations control the mind. So if you're motivated to be competitive, or you're motivated to go out and have fun with your friends, or you're motivated to pass your exams, all those different motivations will change the shape of your mind, okay? However, although I was always into the evolutionary model, the main therapy, so there's a difference between your model and the therapy that you use. The main therapy was cognitive behavior therapy. And so I was lucky enough to do a little bit of training with Aaron Beck and Ivy Blackburn, who were the trainers. And so we would use a lot of cognitive therapy with depression. Now, as you probably know, depressed people tend to have a lot of quite negative thoughts about themselves, such as being a failure, unlovable, and so forth. And the mood and the thought seem chase each other. So when you become depressed, the way you think is quite depressing. And then, of course, you have negative thoughts, and then you feel more depressed. So the idea was really to help people stand back from their negative thoughts and generate alternative thoughts that would maybe break up that loop. And that can work for people, certainly can. But it was also known in the 80s that sometimes people would say, well, I know how to change my thinking, but I still feel, I know I wasn't to blame for my abuse, but I still feel like I was. I know I'm not a failure, but I still feel like a failure. So there was this mismatch between what people was doing cognitively and what they were feeling. So one day when I was working with a very complex chronic lady, she had many overdoses and had bipolar illness and was quite ill. So we were working with some of the cognitive stuff. And the story of her was that she had been adopted at quite an early age and was adopted into a family that was quite aggressive and very critical. Her adopted mother would, tell her off a lot and hit her a lot and things. So it was a difficult adoption for her. And so she had this idea that she shouldn't really have been born. Nobody really wanted her. And she would often slump into these deep depressions of feeling that, I shouldn't really be here. I'd be better off dead. Nobody really wants me. My family only love me because they're good people, but not because there's anything good about me. So that was and that's not an uncommon experience for people with severe depression. So anyway, she was able to stand back and generate some alternative thoughts, like, well, actually, I think my husband does love me, cares about me and she was able to give lots of examples, and indeed he did. And she had some lovely children, and they were lovely children. They did well at school, and she'd held down a job. So she was able to have all these alternative thoughts, you see. But she said, yes, it's true, but I just can't feel it. So I said to her one day, and I'd like to tell you this was a stroke of genius, but I don't think it was, not really. I didn't know what else to ask. So I asked her, I said, how do you actually hear those thoughts in your mind? How do you hear them? Speak them out as you actually hear them. And she said, as I actually hear them. And I said, yeah. What all those coping thoughts. And she said, okay. And this is what happened. So she looked at me. She was reading her alternative thoughts, and she said, come on, you're doing cognitive therapy. You got a husband who loves you, haven't you? You got some lovely children. You've held down a job. For goodness sake, look at the evidence. And I was a little bit shocked because she was very, very aggressive. I said, is that how you actually hear them in your mind? And she said, yeah. I've got to believe this stuff, haven't I? I've got to make myself believe it. So this trying to push it, was really quite a problem. So I said to her, well, what about if you simply created a compassionate part of you and a compassionate, wisdom and all that, to really see the compassion in your thoughts? And she said, no, I'm not doing that. That's weak. That's pathetic. Now, Natalie and Lorena and other people have seen the video, so they know the lady I'm talking about. So no, she didn't want to do it. So that was the second shock. The first shock was the real hostility that people had in the brain when they were trying to be helpful. So the criticism wasn't being carried in the content, it was being carried in the emotion of the thought, not the content of the thought. The second was that they didn't want to do it. And indeed, they found it very difficult to do it. And the third shock was that as we began to do it, we ran into all kinds of problems, which I hadn't anticipated. Now, looking back, it was probably quite naive on my part, but in reality, the situation was when you begin to engage with compassion and motivational system, you'll open up whatever's in that system. Now, this is a classical conditioning aspect, really, because look, imagine that you like to go on holidays. Love holidays. Every time you see the advert for a holiday, you think, oh, holiday. But then one day when you go on holidays, you're beaten up, robbed, and put into the hospital. So what happens next year when you think about holidays? Will you remember all the wonderful holidays? Probably not. What will come back will be trauma. Now, any motivational system that has a trauma in it, when you tap that system, that is the thing that will come out, because it's always threat first. So for example, if children have been hit or rejected if they were assertive, when you start to do assertiveness training, they don't feel powerful, they get anxious. So when you start to stimulate these caring systems, instead of thinking, oh yes, now I feel soothed and wonderful, what's coming back at them is the memories of when they were cared about, when their parents hit them or rejected them or neglected them, the memories of being alone or abandoned, because it'll always be threat first, right? If there's any threat in that system, threat memory in that system, that's what will start to come out. So this was the third surprise in a way, although I should have known it, I suppose, but that when we started to do compassionate work, people began to run into unprocessed rage and unprocessed grief. Because it was unprocessed, they started dissociating. They didn't like it. So you start doing compassionate work and people say, oh, no, I don't like it. This is making me anxious. I don't want to do it. Or I don't know, I just feel irritated. I don't want this compassionate work. Ooh, no, I don't want to do it. So the most important thing, I think, when you're doing therapy is to be very aware that any system, any motivational system that's got a toxic memory or trauma memory in it, when you tap it, you'll open it up. It's the same, unfortunately, with sexuality. You know, people like sex, but if they get horrible sexual experience, and that will create a toxic experience to your own sexual feelings. When your own sexual feelings start, you get that trauma coming back. So that was that part of it, really, of those three key themes. And then obviously I was also interested in an evolutionary model, which I mentioned, because I was interested in how these systems work from an evolutionary and physiological point of view. And I'd also been, since my university days, very interested in meditations. Now in the 70s, it was all Maharishi and the Beatles and Om and incense, because I used to like to go to the meetings at university, the meditation meetings, because that's where all the lovely ladies went. You see, they all went off to the meditation groups. Oh, I'll go there. It's fantastic. So I wasn't really interested in the meditations, but I was quite interested in some of the ladies that were going. But then I got interested in the meditations. So from there, over the years, became more and more interested in the Mahayana traditions, the Tibetan traditions, not so much the Theravada, but the Tibetan traditions, and in particular, the whole issue about the link between mindfulness and compassion and bodhicitta meditations and all, various other things. So I was very interested in that, and was very interested in the fact that, the Buddha had argued all those years ago that if you create a compassion motivation will help you with the poison, what they call the poisons or the unwholesome elements of the mind. And in many ways, Buddhism has quite an evolutionary view. I mean, they don't use those concepts, of course, but they do have the view that we all just kind of are here, and we have a brain that has these potential poisons or bad things that can just emerge. And when I was doing some training with the Dalai Lama many years ago, it was a huge group. It wasn't a one-to-one or anything like that. So I was in a big group, and he told this lovely story about the link between mindfulness and compassion. And he tells a story that when he was a young man, he used to like to fix wristwatches because he loves gadgets. So he was in the monastery at Lhasa, and he had this beautiful watch that the traveler had given him. And he's just about to fix it, and then he dropped a screw right into the middle of the watch. And in that moment, he went, which is Tibetan, oh shit, picked up a hammer and smashed the watch, you see. And so we looked at him, we went, oh my God. So he said, the thing is, in that moment of mindlessness, I had done exactly the opposite of my true intention. My true intention had been to build a beautiful watch. And in that moment of frustration, just that moment of frustration, I had destroyed any possibility of that. I had destroyed my own intention. And this is why mindfulness and compassion go together, because the intention to live to the intention of compassion, the bodhicitta or whatever, and then mindfulness is what helps you travel that route. You stay attuned to what is arising within you to be able to live to your intention, to live the compassionate life. So that was the kind of idea. So I wasn't so much into the more mindfulness to settle or anything like that, but more my approach was more the mindfulness in order to be aware, in order to live to the intention. So mindfulness to settle the mind, stress reduction, that's all great stuff, but that's not the bit that I was into so much. So so those were the three things. And then luckily I had opportunities. I did 2 years psychodynamic training in group psychotherapy and 4 years Jungian training in Jungian archetype theory, which I loved because it's all evolutionary stuff. So we used to get, worked in the day hospital, we had supervision every week, and it was fantastic. So I learned a lot from that. So that is a bit of a long story, I'm so sorry, but that's my background really.
Gracias, Paul. Y estabas mencionando a la conexión o al puente o a la integración de mindfulness y compasión, y hablaste de la intención de estar presente. Y un poco la pregunta inicial, me gustaría retomar esto, cómo, aprovechando que estás acá, cómo podemos, todos los seres humanos, cultivar esta intención más allá del contexto en el que estamos atravesando. ¿Cuáles son tus sugerencias? ¿Cuál es tu visión para poder cultivar esta intención? Nos pasa a muchos como terapeutas, pero también hay personas que trabajan en otras profesiones y ¿cómo cultivamos la compasión? ¿Cómo podemos cultivar esta intención?
It's a wonderful question, Natalie. So a couple of things really is, firstly, the wisdom of knowing why you would want to do it. So the first thing is the wisdom of why you would want to do it. So we'll take a step back and say part of the reason that we want to do it is because we all just find ourselves here in a body with a mind and a brain that's doing all kinds of strange things. So none of us chose to be here. I mean, when we do our training, as you know, when we work with our clients, as you know, we say to them, how many of you chose to have 2 arms and 2 legs? Put your hands up. Nobody did. How many of you chose to have a head and ears and eyes? Nope. How many chose to put food in one end and let it out the other? No. How many chose to have lungs that you need to breathe every otherwise you die? No. So what about your mind then? How many of you chose to have anxiety or depression or fear or lust or whatever? How many of you chose to wake up in the middle of the night anxious? I'm going to put my alarm clock on, you know what I mean? Because I want to wake up and then get myself anxious. I want to do that. So most of what happens to us that causes us pain, mostly, not always, but most of it is we don't choose it. It comes. So one of the key things is to recognize then that we all have a mind that's been built for us, not by us. We are part of the flow of life. We're here for just a short time. And on this journey, we have all this stuff which has been created by our genes. And not only that, but as a result of our upbringing, we become a certain type of person. So if I had been kidnapped as a 3-day-old baby into a violent drug gang, this version of Paul Gilbert wouldn't exist. A very traumatized Paul Gilbert, maybe a very violent Paul Gilbert, you know, possibly dead, possibly a drug addict. It's a very different version. So the idea that we have an authentic self, I think, is problematic. There are versions of ourselves that get created according to the genes that we have and the lives that we've fallen into, basically. Because I wouldn't have chosen to be kidnapped as a 3-day-old baby any more than any one of you listening to this chose to be born in Argentina or somewhere else in South America, or to have the parents you had, or the traumas or whatever it is. You didn't choose any of that. So once we begin to realize then that it's all kind of, this is all tricky stuff. 2 things happen. Firstly, we stop blaming and shaming ourselves, because if you do that, you're just starting to trying to push things down, and you don't want to know this part of you, and you don't want to know that part of you. So don't blame and shame, because you didn't choose any of it. It's not your fault. First thing, very important. But, this is the big but, given that your brain is potentially quite chaotic, given that your brain can cause quite a lot of pain to you and other people, then the task is to try to work it out so that we can live to be helpful, not harmful. And we recognize that that will be good for us because it will feel better. We'll get more joy out of life. We'll function better. Our bodies will be better. And also our relationships will be better. And we'll create a better place to live because, you know, if we were all compassionate with each other, that would be great, wouldn't it? So firstly, then the movement into compassion is based upon what we call wisdom. And this wisdom is insight into what it is to be a biological being on this planet at this time in the flow of life for 60, 70, 80 years, whatever it is. That's it. To understand that, right? We are a consciousness in this mind. And it's when we become conscious of this mind, how we then make decisions of what we're going to do with this mind. It's a little bit like if you drive down the motorway and all of a sudden you get hit by a snowstorm or something like that. That's not your fault, but you must drive carefully. You're going to have to slow down, otherwise you'll crash, won't you? See? So we all know that there are so many things in life that it's not our fault, but we have to take responsibility, be careful. So our brains are not our fault. These desires that we have, some of the things that go on in our minds are not our fault, but we have to be careful because even though it's not our fault, we have to try as best we can. So the first point of compassion really is understanding why you want to do it. You know, it's not because it's, you know, nice and God will love you or whatever it is. He may well do. But the main thing is a deep understanding that if you don't learn how to drive in a snowstorm, you will crash. If you don't learn how to come to understand the nature of your mind and what's going on and why you get grabbed by these painful feelings of rage or depression, it's going to be tricky. So the next thing is, okay, once you understand it, so the next thing is, so, okay, I understand I've got to learn how to drive in a snowstorm or whatever it is. So how do I do it then? So then that's the next thing. So firstly, we use the body to support the mind. That's the first thing. And you had a wonderful talk with Steve Porges and Sue Carter, which I thought was fantastic because I listened to it. I didn't understand all the Spanish, but I liked all the English bits. And Steve set up a lot of the reasons why beginning to work with training your own autonomic nervous system, doing exercises for your autonomic nervous system is so important, just like doing exercises for your body. If you want to get physically fit, then you exercise your body. But if you want to get your autonomic nervous system fit, or you want to get your frontal cortex fit, then you do exercises, you practice, you stimulate systems. And Steve has done some brilliant work on what is called polyvagal theory, which you probably know about. And that is certainly one thing that you want to be doing, using your body to support your mind. And that involves breathing exercises, chanting, dancing, movement, a whole range of stuff. Then the next thing is using your mind to create experiences that stimulate your compassion system. Now, there's nothing strange about this. For example, many years ago when I was training, was in a sex therapy clinic. One of the things that we would work with people was helping them practice fantasizing, using fantasizing, exploring what happens in their body and so forth and so on. Because fantasy stimulates physiological systems in the brain, right? We know that. You can lay in bed and have a nice fantasy and you'll be stimulating your body. So using the same basic ideas, we can practice certain kinds of visualizations to stimulate compassion systems in the body. Okay. And so when we're working with clients, we spend a lot of time of helping them find their own fantasies, their own images. Okay, so sometimes we have the image of a compassionate other talking to them, and they create that image for them, just as if it was we're doing sex therapy, they'd create their own images. I can't give them an image, they would have to create it themselves so that they could feel the feelings in the body. The same when we do compassionate imagery, of creating an image and focusing on an image and focusing on being receiving of compassion from the image. What happens in your body? How do you push it away? Do you not trust it? Do you not like it? What happens if it's a male figure or a female figure, or maybe even an animal? Sometimes people create images of bears or something like that. And the concept of then creating these fantasies to stimulate these systems in the mind. The third is the concept of what we call a compassionate mind state for you, right? Okay, and that means helping people to imagine if they could be at their compassionate best, what would that be like? How would that work for them? What would they do? And that can take a lot of time, having them do that. And then we invite them to practice that for, half an hour a day or however long, and do one compassionate thing for themselves and somebody else each day. There are lots of behavioral practices, meditation practices, and so on. So those are some of the things, really. Firstly, wisdom about why you want to do it, right? Okay, it's not just about, I want to sort out my stress. It's the wisdom you want to do it is because of you've got so much going on in your head that you never chose, and it can be quite painful to you. And then the wisdom of understanding what body systems you want to exercise, like your autonomic nervous system or your frontal cortex or whatever, and then do the exercises. So I hope that answers it a little bit.
Sí, creo que es muy interesante. Hace poco fue el Compassionate Mind Conference, la conferencia, el Compassionate Mind, y Paul en una charla, justo vos hablaste acerca de que las terapias por ahí del futuro iban a empezar a ser como más terapias neurofisiológicas o que te incluyan a la fisiología, y por ahí salirnos un poco, no solamente a nivel de las terapias, pero creo que también en medicina y creo que también en la educación, empezar a enseñar acerca de, a generar sabiduría acerca de esta relación que existe entre nuestras mentes y nuestros estados fisiológicos, y al revés, ¿no? Cómo activando ciertos estados internos también modificamos las cogniciones, la relación, y salir de esta mirada fragmentada que tenemos y poder integrar más estas disciplinas, ¿no? Poder usarlo un poco a favor. Todos estos circuitos que ya sabemos que tenemos, pero bueno, en lugar de que se nos vuelvan tan tramposos, usarlos a nuestro favor, que es un poco lo que usa también y lo que hace CFT.
Yes, terrific. Yes, that's terrific, Lorena. Absolutely, that's right. And the more we understand these circuits, like Steve and Alan Shaw, for example, has done a lot of work on the right brain and the orbital frontal cortex, all this stuff. The more we understand these mechanisms, then we can do studies where we give people different things to do, where we can find out how is that stimulating that system, and how does that exercise stimulate that system. So we can begin to have a scientific approach to how do we stimulate different bodily systems. And that's very exciting, I think.
Sí, también para mí. Y por ahí otra pregunta que quería hacer es, por ahí más para las personas que no están tan familiarizadas con el concepto de la compasión en sí misma, ¿por qué sería la compasión hoy algo a cultivar, sobre todo en estos momentos tan oscuros de la humanidad y en donde el contexto realmente muchas veces promueve que estemos en contacto con nuestra propia parte oscura, los humanos, ¿no? Esto que estamos viviendo como humanidad realmente produce muchas veces, como vos decías al principio, activaciones epigenéticas o traumas tal vez, y cómo creo que tal vez la compasión puede ayudar en cierta forma. Entonces, por ahí, ¿qué es la compasión para la gente que no está tan familiarizada? ¿Y por qué la compasión podría ayudar a nuestro lado un poquito más oscuro?
Okay, so we have an evolutionary model of compassion, all right, which means that rather than looking at all different sort of qualities of compassion, like empathy and doing factor analysis and that sort of thing, we want to go right back to the beginning. So caring behavior evolved primarily, but not only, in the parent-child relationship. It's what is called a K-selected reproductive strategy. It's good, that, isn't it? So you can say that at a party. Oh, caring. It's a K-selective reproductive strategy. Makes you sound very clever. But what it means is that instead of laying hundreds of eggs like turtles do, which is called an R-selective strategy, K-selective strategies means that you have live birth. Well, not so much live birth because birds also are the same, but you have parental caring. The parent provides resources for the offspring, and those resources, there are three main resources. There's the resource of food, obviously, because the infant can't protect themselves. So birds go off and get worms, don't they? And then mammals have breasts and so on. Then there's also protection, which is very important to protect from harm and so on and so on. And the third one for warm-blooded animals is called thermal regulation, keeping the infant warm or cool if it's too hot, right? And we often talk about that, don't we? That the concept of warmth is a kindness. So those are three basic qualities. And then, of course, with humans, there's all the other stuff that goes with it about learning and emotion regulation and a secure base and safe haven and that sort of thing. So this gives us what we call an algorithm, a stimulus response algorithm. And the stimulus response algorithm is simply if A, do B. Now for caring, it's if the infant shows distress or need, if that's the signal from the infant, then take action to alleviate that. And many, 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 many species are able to do that. They're able to be sensitive to the cause or the distress cause or the needs of their infant and either feed them, rescue them, or keep them warm. So birds will sit back on the nest, mammals will curl up with the mum or whatever. So that's very important. And that actually is the first stage of compassion. Not only that, what we know, and Steve has talked a lot about this, is that we know the physiology of this. We know the physiology of caring and how it began with oxytocin and the beginnings of the changes in the vagus system. And that algorithm is very different to a threat algorithm. Now, a threat algorithm, if there's a threat, run like hell. That goes through the amygdala and different systems of the brain and sympathetic nervous system and so forth. So these algorithms are linked into these different physiologies. So that's the first thing, we understand it. So that then becomes sensitivity. Compassion is a sensitivity to suffering and need in self and others with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. Now there's one slight complication to this, and that is that humans have these very complicated cognitive competencies, and we have three types. One type is that we have insight from reasoning. So we can reason, we can understand the relationship between things, we can make attributions about, you know, this caused that and that's going to cause that. And if I talk to Lorena about that, she'll probably think this, all that stuff. So, and this allows us to have science. This is the basis of science, understanding the world. Okay, so for example, early humans worked out that if they put seeds in the ground rather than eat them all at the time, they can grow seeds and then they have a harvest, right? So they were using their intelligence, the intelligence of reasoning. The second competency is an empathic competency. And this is the ability to begin to understand theory of mind. And humans, that's pretty, in some humans, that's pretty sophisticated, this capacity for empathic understanding of the mind of the other, but also empathic understanding for one's own mind. And the third insightful competency is that we have a consciousness of consciousness, which gives us the ability to have a certain type of awareness, so you can be mindful. Now, as far as we know, I might be wrong about this, but animals can't be. They can't choose to pay attention on purpose. They can't do that. You know, lions certainly intend to hunt and kill prey, but they don't have knowing intentionality. They don't have that mindful awareness of what they're doing. They can't decide to stop and say, oh, all of this killing, it's so cruel. I'm going to become a vegetarian. I'm going to be a vegetarian lion. I've decided I want to give up. They can't do that because they don't have knowing intentionality. Now, knowing intentionality is a game changer. So compassion, then we have a caring. We know what the caring is. But when you then bring knowing intentionality and you use your wisdom and this awareness of what you're doing things on purpose, mindfully on purpose to be caring, and you're working out carefully what would be helpful and what would not be helpful, that's compassion. The other thing about compassion, which makes it different to caring, is compassion is only given to sentient beings. So you can care for your garden, and you can look after your car, and you can care for your car, polish it, make sure all the oil is right. That's caring for it. You know how it functions, but you wouldn't have compassion for your garden or your car. If your car has an accident, you wouldn't say, I've got so much compassion for you, I'm so sorry, because it can't suffer. So compassion is only for sentient minds that can suffer, this consciousness part, right? The ability to suffer and experience pain. So those are very important qualities. So then we become aware that what we want to do in compassion is we want to get this algorithm, this ability to be sensitive to suffering and then work out what is going to be helpful. Now, when you're with your clients, this is quite important because there's a lot of rather not helpful things on the internet about compassion, that it's linked to kindness or love or whatever it is. And that will, if you let them go down that road, then they go off on tangents. Kindness is quite different to compassion for all kinds of reasons. So kindness is more about doing nice things for people. Like if I remember your birthday, like it's Arena's birthday today. Fantastic, wonderful, happy birthday, happy birthday. That would be maybe a kindness. But if I was to donate her a kidney, that's compassion. So the more sacrifice there is, the more hardship there is, that's more likely to be compassion. And for the religious people, we talk about the compassion of Christ because of the nature of the sacrifice. We don't talk about what a kind person to die for us. No, it is the compassion of the act, you see. So compassion involves courage and wisdom and sacrifice in a way that kindness doesn't. And you don't need to love people in order to be compassionate, and you don't need to love yourself either, all that stuff, self-love. I mean, there's lots of things about me that I don't particularly like very much, but I can be compassionate to them. You don't have to love this stuff, but you do need to accept it. It's part of what you are. Blah, blah. So how do you then bring this to your clients? This clarity of understanding, because if they come with all these other ideas of compassion, they can say, I've got to be nice to myself, I've got to love myself. No, forget about that, throw that. It's simply this. Imagine, we say to our client, look, imagine you have a friend, right? And can you bring it to mind a friend? Yeah, bring to mind a friend. In fact, we can do this together. I'll do this with you as an example. Okay, bring to mind a friend. Okay, just bring a friend, somebody you really care about for a few seconds. Bring their face, remember what you like about them. Why you like them. Okay, so we prime the client with the memory and the feeling of a friend, okay? And then we say, I want you to imagine that this friend calls you up one day and says, oh no, I've just had a letter to say I have to go to hospital for an operation and it's quite serious, but I can't go. I'm so frightened. I hate hospitals. I can't go. I just don't know what I'm gonna do. So you say to the client, so there you are, there's your friend, you really care about them, and they have this thing they're very frightened to face, right? They don't know what they're going to do. How would you be with them? And 9 times out of 10, clients will say, oh, that would be awful. I'd be so sorry. And I would listen to them, and I would maybe go and talk to them and be kind to them. Would you be critical of them and tell them not to be so silly, get themselves up to, no, I wouldn't do that. That wouldn't be very helpful, would it? Oh, I see. So you understand that when people are struggling and suffering and frightened, being supportive and helpful, not critical, is really important. Being sensitive to their pain, is that right? Yes. Well, of course you would be, wouldn't you? Ah, okay. So that's the first step of compassion. So then what would you like to do? Well, I don't know. Maybe I'd go with them. I'd say, I'll come with you. Look, I'll take you to the hospital. I'll sit with you. It'll be okay. I'll hold your hand. You say, so why would you do that? Well, because if you're struggling and you're having somebody support you and care about you, that makes such a difference, doesn't it? Oh, you say as a therapist. Then you say to your client, you have wonderful wisdom. You have wonderful wisdom because, look, you know that when people are struggling and they're frightened, we are sensitive to their pain. We understand it. We don't shame them or criticize them for them. And then we try to work out how to give them the courage to face what they have to face. That is compassion. You have wonderful wisdom. You're going to do great in this therapy because you understand it. So that's how those are the kinds of things you can do to set it up. Okay. And there are lots of these guided discoveries, little things that we do in the therapy to help people realize that they actually have a lot more insight, a lot more wisdom than they think they do. And part of your skill as a therapist is finding these little Socratic engagements so that people discover their own wisdoms. So that's really quite important. And then they begin to, and then so you can then discuss with the fact. So if you could learn to be sensitive to your pain and suffering, and then make a commitment to find the wisdom to work with it, how would that be with you? What would that be like? Would that be okay? And then if they say, oh no, I can't do that, you say, so which part can't you do? Is it moving towards being sensitive to it? Or is it finding the wisdom? And then you say, and then you start to break it down and help them with each part. See. Anyway, I hope that answers it a little bit.
Sí, sí, por supuesto. Es muy interesante esta parte que esto se aprende y que es activar estados internos, ¿no? Que no es algo que no tenemos, sino que está adentro nuestro y que tal vez cuando uno empieza a desarrollar la sabiduría de cómo funciona nuestro cerebro, nuestra fisiología, esto de poder activar intencionalmente estos estados internos y aprender a hacerlo resulta muy importante, sobre todo para el momento de la humanidad en la que estamos viviendo, ¿no? El poder empezar a tener la sabiduría para activar estos estados internos.
A mí me gustaría compartir, Paul, quedan unos minutitos más de esta hermosa entrevista, esta pregunta que está haciendo Liz Perdomo, un poco en línea con lo que venimos conversando, porque es más difícil ser autocompasivos que ser compasivos con otros.
It's a great question. I don't know. Who would you tell me? No, a whole range of reasons, really. There can be all kinds of, because you are in your own head. So you know all the stuff that goes on, all the things you're ashamed about, all the traumas that have gone on and everything like that. Whereas, of course, for other people, you're not in their heads. You're just kind of responding to them in a certain kind of way. I think a lot of the reasons that we find compassion difficulty is first because we don't understand it. We think it's just about being nice or letting ourselves off the hook or something like that. So the first thing is that people don't actually understand what is involved. The second thing is that people feel that if I'm compassionate, then I can't be angry. You know, I can't deal with the dark side. I mean, Natty mentioned the dark side, but actually compassion is for the dark side. It is for the pain. It is for the suffering. It is for the rages that we experience. That is compassion. Compassion is descending into pain, not away from it. This isn't compassion. It's getting into your pain, right? So misunderstandings, and as I said earlier in the talk, one of the main reasons that people find it is because, frankly, when people begin to do self-compassion, they become aware of deep scars inside. The number of times in therapy, we work with people and they say, I didn't realize I was in that much pain. I didn't realize just how much I yearned to be loved and wanted, because they've dissociated from it, see? And so when you start on the journey, it's tricky. And sometimes people say, oh, I don't deserve it or whatever. And then you say, so which bit don't you deserve? To be sensitive to your pain? You don't deserve that bit. Or to find wisdom? You don't deserve wisdom. Is that which bit you know? So you always break it down like that. But generally, the people find it difficult because they have all these misunderstandings about compassion. And at root, compassion is a healing process, but it's also a process that can, at times, reveal deep wounds, and that people find that very difficult. I mean, you say to people, say, you know, have a client says, I don't deserve it. You say, what would be your greatest fear of suddenly feeling completely loved and wanted and that you're a wonderful person? What would happen if you really suddenly became aware that you are worthy of being deeply loved and a wonderful person. What happens in you when I say that? What's your resistance? What pushes back at me against that? And you can see it in the eyes, you know, they start to water up. No, I don't deserve that. So, you know, because of how we live now in our Western society, we don't live in hunter-gatherer groups like we used to. That's what we were evolved for, to have close relationships and to feel a part of caring, sharing communities. We don't have that anymore. We have deep wounds. There are deep wounds in the Western mind, deep fractures of a sense of disconnection, loneliness, having to prove that we're worth something, having to show that we're up to the mark, you know, all that stuff. Am I good enough? Am I a good enough therapist? Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. So we've got so many deep wounds. It's very difficult for people to be self-compassionate. And then you have all of the self-criticism as well, which is another story, but yeah.
Paul, tenemos una pregunta de Álvaro, que también un poco en línea con lo que venís exponiendo y compartiendo. Álvaro pregunta si el miedo a la compasión o el bloqueo a la compasión tiene alguna relación con el tipo de apego que las personas tienen.
Yes, very much so.
Okay. Bien.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, very much so.
Y ¿cuál es la Fede García pregunta cuál es la relación entre la aceptación y la compasión, si es que la hay?
It's a brilliant question, because, you know, the ACT, Steve and Hazenby were very keen on acceptance. Acceptance is very, very important. And acceptance is quite different from, self-acceptance is very different from self-love. You know, I don't think Steve talks much about self-love, but he talks quite a lot about the importance of acceptance. Because, you know, there are quite a lot of things within us that are very painful. They're difficult. You know, one of the lady that I was talking to you about right at the beginning of the session, with her depression, she just hated them. You know, she really hated being depressed. She'd wake up in the morning and be very angry and I'm depressed again. I feel terrible. You know, that's horrible. So acceptance is important, but it has to be a compassionate based acceptance, because otherwise you're just asking people to accept something they hate is very, very difficult. But if you can then begin to help people recognize, so let's have a look at this depression. When did it start? What was that about? What was the real loss you experienced in your life? So for this lady, it was really about the loss in your life was the loss of your biological mother, right? That's where it started. That was the big beginning of all of this. And so we begin that journey, which then begins the grieving process. And through that process, acceptance comes. So acceptance is a process, compassion from my point of view, facilitates a capacity to come to terms with and to accept and to understand why I feel like what I feel. So compassion is the journey into acceptance.
Tenemos otra pregunta de Marina, que si nos decidimos sumergir en ese viaje de la compasión, ¿cómo afectan los traumas en el cultivo de la compasión, en la posibilidad de poder cultivar la compasión?
Yeah, this is a brilliant question. So, lovely question. So the key thing, right, we have a particular model of trauma, and maybe one day you'll invite Deborah Lee, who does things. The first thing is that understanding how your threat system works, okay? Now, we call this multiple selves or multiple emotions, that when you have a trauma or a threat, you will tend to have 3 types at least of threat-based emotions. So imagine you've been diagnosed with cancer or any major life of traumas will activate 3 basic, 1, 2, 3 basic emotions. And these are anger, anxiety, and sadness, grief. Okay, so imagine you've just been diagnosed with trauma. There'll be part of you that's angry. Why me? What's this about? Why didn't they discover it earlier? There'll be a part of you that's very anxious. What does this mean about my future? And there'll be part of you that's very sad because you think you might die or whatever. You might leave people you love behind. So that's common. But the same with trauma. In trauma, there's an element which is going to be very angry about what's happened to you and why it happened, particularly if it's abuse-based trauma. There'd be a part of you that was very frightened because you couldn't control it. And there'd be a part of you that's extremely sad at the way it's interfered with your life or what you lost or whatever. So before we go anywhere near trauma, before we go near the trauma, the first thing in compassion is to work with the emotions around it. So bringing this trauma to mind, can we explore the anger you feel about it? Can we explore the anxiety you feel around it? Can we explore the sadness and the grieving you have because it happened to you? So, that is really the first part. And then we develop a compassion. Can we have compassion for our anger towards our trauma, compassion for our anxiety towards our trauma, compassion for our sadness? Can we hold our sadness of the trauma that this happened to you and this caused all this pain to you? Can we work with that grieving about that stuff? Now, sometimes you find if you do that, the trauma kind of settles itself. Deborah Lee does a lot of work on trauma, says when you go through these processes and you work through the emotions associated with the trauma, sometimes the person just says, look, I've actually come to terms with it now, I worked it out myself. But if you do need to do exposure, after you've done the big three, then again, what you do is you invite the client to think about how they would like to engage with exposure while holding a compassionate visitation. So you can do memory, the memory work, bringing the memory of the trauma step by step. Don't overwhelm your client, and just hold that trauma in a wise, compassionate mind. And the wise, compassionate mind is the mind that helps you understand this was not your fault. This was not your fault. Okay, you didn't deserve that, and really holding that principle. And if you have people say, yeah, but I could have done something about it, I could have stopped, then again, you just hold that position. Okay. Now, sometimes you can also do things like acting out the trauma. You get the person to say, if the trauma was very young, try and get them to maybe stand as if they're a 4-year-old, very, very small. I mean, there are lots of action things that you can do with trauma. Sometimes we don't do much in the way of re-scripting, but some people do. EMDR can be quite useful for some people. They use that as well. So there are lots of cognitive approaches to trauma. There are lots of other interventions, evidence-based interventions that can be quite helpful. And the key thing with CFT is always saying to people, let's explore this and see what happens. Do have a go with this and have a go with that, and let's try this and see how you go. But always, if you create a compassionate body state and mind state, you've taught them the breathing, you've taught them how to engage in the body, ground in the body, center in the body, bring the wisdom to mind, have the friendly facial expression, that real intention to bring that compassionate, friendly wisdom to whatever you do, that makes it, in my view, a lot easier.
Gracias, Paul. Lore.
Sí, bueno, y por último, porque ya casi estamos en hora, pero nos gustaría hacer una pregunta que hizo Luna, y ella pregunta y dice, si la compasión es una cualidad innata en el ser humano, ¿dónde y cuándo es que perdemos esta cualidad?
Yes, it is an innate quality, but of course, like all qualities, like intelligence or good looks, you can't always have them like me, No, like all these qualities, there are variations within a population. So, for example, people who have psychopathic traits, now these individuals can be quite empathic in a certain kind of way. That's how they get on in the world, but they have no caring motivation at all. They really don't care very much. Now, we've actually done some studies in Portugal, actually, in a forensic situation, and we've shown that compassion-focused therapy can actually reduce psychopathic traits in forensic youth. So that's very, very exciting to us. On the other hand, people who have what we call the Asperger's, on the autistic spectrum, these individuals have the motivation, but they the empathic skills are not very good. So the key thing when you say, do we all have the capacity for compassion? Firstly, it depends what element of it you know, some people have the motivation, but they don't have the skills. Some people have the skills, but they don't have the motivation. And also, compassion is not one thing, right? For example, a firefighter will risk their lives to save you. Okay, that's amazing. That's completely wonderful compassion. But they might not make the best partner or parent. Somebody who makes a wonderful parent might not make the best firefighter. So the other thing we've got to be aware of in compassion is not to treat it as one thing, but some people are very good at some aspects of compassion, but not others. And so when we talk about, you know, how do you gain it or how do you lose it? Which bit, what part, in what context, under what conditions? That's the key thing, right? So that's the important thing. Now, the other thing is that, can you train it? Yes, you certainly can, particularly compassion when it's about dealing with emotional issues as opposed to physical issues or, you know, firefighting, whatever. Then you definitely can. And even I think with people with narcissistic issues, you can. It's fragile at the moment. It's all just very tentative. Maybe we'll end up disappointed because you know what these are like. You get good results to begin with, and then the follow-up isn't so good. So we're keeping our fingers crossed. We can't guarantee, but who knows? We're hoping. But my Portuguese colleagues have done brilliant work. So that's exciting. So yeah. So it's, and I think also with different people, we can find compassion easier with different people. So don't think of it as a one, you either have it or you don't. It's about developing it in certain ways, in certain contexts. Like one of the earlier questions was, I'm very compassionate to other people, but not myself. Okay, so you have compassion then, you just can't direct it. Okay. So always think in terms of these qualities, but they're contextual. Is important, yeah.
Yes, eso es importante también, ¿no? El contexto, hay ciertos contextos, los medios a veces, el lugar particular donde uno está, donde tampoco favorece, por más de que tengamos las actitudes innatas, tal vez los contextos no están no favorecen el desarrollo o la activación, ¿no?
Yes, that's right. That doesn't. And you know, one of the problems in Western society is it's very competitive. And competitive motivations tend to squash compassion. And, you know, the part of the problem we have to come to terms with is the fact that humans have a terrible dark side, you know. We are probably one of the nastiest, most vicious species that have ever existed with our tortures and our slavery and many of the horrible things that humans have done. And that's because we don't know how to regulate our minds. And when our minds are simply regulated by context and nothing else, we can be in trouble. So, you know, the context of being a Roman, for example, would mean I'd be quite happy to go to the Roman games or accept crucifixions. In that context, I would be like that, right? So context can't be relied on. Do not rely on context to guide you, because it can lead you to terrible things, not as well as good things. So I think it is quite important that we recognize how important it is for us to make decisions about to live to be helpful, not harmful. This bodhicitta, this basic thing, which for me in the Mahayana tradition is the center of how I live. I don't always succeed. My wife tells me I'm a grumpy old man, but there we are. I try to live to bodhicitta principle. That's such an important thing for me as best I can, because, you know, we all have a terrible dark side.
Gracias, Paul. Y a mí me gustaría hacerte esta última pregunta. La semana pasada pudimos preguntarle a Chris Irons sobre la fatiga de la compasión. Y me gustaría preguntarte qué he leído en varios libros o en varios artículos que hay algunos autores que llaman a la compasión idiota o la compasión egoísta. Y me gustaría conocer cuál es tu opinión con respecto a si la compasión puede tener esta cualidad de ser egoísta, de ser idiota.
I think we did some research on this, right? We looked at what was regarded as compassionate fatigue in nurses. It doesn't exist, right? What exists is burnout. And when you actually do the research, what you find is that a lot of the staff, like with COVID wards and everything, they're simply exhausted. I mean, they're just exhausted. And they're also pretty angry with the management, or having to do whatever it is they do. Quite a lot of anger with it as well. But don't take compassion fatigue different from exhausted. I mean, you're simply exhausted, right? It's not a compassionate fatigue. You're just absolutely exhausted. A lot of these, because we did a I don't know whether you saw it. We did an interview with a specialist physiotherapist on a COVID ward. And, you know, they just have to go home and just turn off, not because they've got compassion fatigue, but they are mentally exhausted. You know, they've got every other fatigue as well. You know, they don't particularly want to go out. They don't want to socialize. They just want to rest, you know. The other thing is that I think, which is quite important, is that Matthew Ricard and Tanya Singer talk about the fact that if you just emotionally connect to people all the time and in a kind of empathic way, so you feel their pain, feel their pain, feel their pain, again, you'll get emotionally exhausted. And the point is that, yes, we do need to engage with people's pain, but we also need to be thinking about the second aspect of compassion is what will be helpful. And Matthew Ricard says, you know, if I just do meditation on the suffering of these people, and I just hold this suffering in mind, hold it in mind, hold it in mind, it's terrible. So you touch pain in order for you to be able to feel it sufficiently to then have this desire to alleviate it. So in your meditations, okay, it's in the Buddhist tradition, it's may you be free of suffering. It's not, may I feel every ounce of your pain and be in pain with you, so I feel as painful as you do. That isn't the meditation at all. The meditation is, may you be free of suffering. May all living things be free of suffering. May I work for all living things to be free of suffering. That's the meditation. Okay, so I think there's a lot of confusion around this idea of compassion fatigue. The other time when you get compassion fatigue is when people have come into the profession really because they want to be rescuers. They're there because they want to make themselves feel good. They're there because if I get a patient better, I feel good. I feel I'm great. Well, if you're in it for that reason, then you will get fatigued, because that's not compassion. Okay, that isn't compassion. You'll get clapped out, because as soon as patients don't get better, then you won't feel it. You won't feel so good anymore. So my own personal view is, I get tired, of course I do, and exhausted, but I don't think I've ever really suffered from compassion fatigue. Not really. I mean, there are people I get really angry with, and oh, you know, there are certain people that just up the road from you, we won't say who. You know, oh no, you know. But I think compassion fatigue is actually quite rare. When you open it up and get into it, actually, it's more like exhaustion, or it wasn't really a compassion motivation in the first place, or they're just burnt out because, and a lot of our nurses actually who were of what were actually saying things like, I'd like to be able to spend more time with my clients, more time with my patients, but there's so much paperwork and I've got so much of this to do, and managers want me to do this. They were angry. They didn't want to do less, they wanted to do more, and they were upset because they couldn't give the care they wanted to give. You know, they were told, oh, you can only see this patient for 10 sessions. And the nurse would say, but they need much more than 10 sessions. I feel terrible because I can't give them what I know they should have. That's the problem. That's the issue. Not, you know, I hope that helps a little bit anyway.
Gracias, Paul, que hoy podamos estar todos con un poquito menos de sufrimiento con este ratito que compartimos. Te queremos volver a agradecer. Gracias a todos los que participaron. Gracias a Motivación Compasiva. Gracias, Paulina, por tu trabajo en la traducción. Y
Thank you, Paulina. Yes, thank you very much.
Para todos los que quieran acceder a más material de lo que es la terapia centrada en la compasión o el entrenamiento compasivo de la mente, los dirigimos a la página del Compassionate Mind, que les escribimos en el chat la página. Pueden acceder a una membresía anual para poder ver muchos más videos, mucho más material de lectura, mucho entrenamiento de Paul haciendo role-playings adentro de la membresía. Y si no, también tienen un montón de artículos a los que pueden acceder. Hay libros en español, La terapia centrada en la compasión y La mente compasiva, son los únicos 2 libros que están traducidos al español, con mucho material para leer y aprender. Y Paul, muchas gracias otra vez, otro año, en otra oportunidad, por acceder a nuestras propuestas y estar acá presente con todos nosotros. Chicas, si quieren despedirlo, yo te mando un beso muy grande, Paul. Te aprecio muchísimo. Muchas gracias.
Gracias
very much.
Gracias, Paul. Thank
por
you,
otro
gracias.
noviembre.
Happy
Gracias.
birthday again to Lorena.
Gracias.
I'm going to have a drink for you now.
Thank you. Me too. Gracias. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Are you going to stay on, Lorena, or
Yes,
are you going to
yes,
go?
I'm here.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for that. It went very quickly, didn't it?
Yes, it was so nice. Thank you.
That's
Thank
great.
you. It was great. Yeah.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yes. So nice. Thank you.
Good. So we've got a supervision in a couple of weeks. That would be nice.
Yes, we'll see there
Yes,
soon.
another one.
See how Natalie's going with her client.
Yeah.
Yes, we continue working there. She's finishing the 3 flows of compassion I share with you.
Yes, very good. Very nice.
Yes, I have a photo from Jane, but yes, that the space of supervision is very, very, very useful. Very useful. Thank you, Paul.
Wonderful. Okay, I'll let you get on with your day and your birthday party and all the wonderful things, and we will be in touch shortly.
Okay, sure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.